They called it evolution. The Raven Guard called it a gift from their Primarch. But Kalor Vane saw what it really was the first time his hands turned to shadow and wouldn't come back. His brothers were changing too, bones bending wrong, skin slipping between solid and smoke. Command knew. They always knew. So why were they still calling it sacred? I became a ghost long before I stopped being a man. That is the truth they will never inscribe upon the memorial stones, the truth they will never whisper in the chapels where our names are honored alongside those of our fallen brothers. The Raven Guard does not speak of what we become, they speak only of what we were and what we must do, and the silence that follows is thick enough to choke on. I am Brother Scout Kalor Vane, and I tell you now that the transformation does not begin when the gene seed is implanted, nor when the surgery scars finally heal and you take your first steps in power armor that hums with the strength of demigods. It begins when you realize that the body you inhabit is no longer entirely yours, that something ancient and hungry has woken inside your flesh, and that the chapter you swore to serve knows exactly what is happening and will never, ever acknowledge it. I was 17 standard years when I was selected from the feral tribes of Kievar's underhives, pulled from a life of scavenging and knife fights in tunnels so dark you learned to see by sound alone. The chaplains told me I was blessed. They told me I carried the potential to bear the legacy of Primarch Corax himself, that my genetic compatibility was rare and precious, that I would become a shadow in the Emperor's service, a blade that struck unseen and withdrew without trace. I believed them. I believed every word, even as the first surgeries began and my body was opened and rebuilt. Even as the pain became so total that I could no longer distinguish between waking and dreaming, even as the gene seed was implanted, and I felt something foreign settle into my chest, like a second heart, cold and patient and waiting. The training grounds on Deliverance were carved from black stone that absorbed light, walls that seemed to drink the glow of the few lumen strips overhead until you moved through corridors that felt less like architecture and more like the throat of some sleeping beast. We trained in near-total darkness, learning to move without sound, to read the tremors in the air that warned of enemy movement, to kill with precision that left no room for hesitation or mercy. There were 30 of us in my intake cohort. By the end of the first year, there were 18. The others did not fail. They simply stopped being compatible, their bodies rejecting the gene seed in ways that required immediate termination before the mutations became uncontrollable. I remember the first time I saw it happen. Saw a brother named Thalen convulse during a training drill, his skin rippling as though something beneath was trying to break free, his eyes rolling white as he screamed in a voice that no longer sounded human. They took him away before the screaming stopped. They told us it was the Emperor's will, that not all souls were strong enough to carry the gift of Corax, that we should honor his sacrifice and continue our training with renewed dedication. We did. We always did. But I remember the smell that lingered in the training hall afterward, something sharp and chemical and wrong, like burnt hair mixed with rotting fruit, and I remember the way the apothecaries looked at us afterward, their eyes scanning each of us with an intensity that felt less like medical concern and more like a farmer inspecting livestock for signs of disease. I passed every trial. I excelled in the shadow walks, the exercises where we moved through mock battlefields in absolute silence, eliminating targets without ever being detected. I learned to read the patterns of enemy patrols, to exploit the blind spots in their awareness, to become so still that I could stand 3 paces from a sentry and remain invisible simply by controlling my breathing and letting the darkness embrace me. The instructors praised my aptitude. They said I had the soul of a true Raven Guard, that Corax himself would have been proud to see such dedication to the craft of unseen warfare. I felt pride then, genuine and warm. The first real pride I had known since leaving the underhives, where pride was a luxury that got you killed. But there were moments, even then, when I felt something else stirring beneath that pride. It started small, almost too subtle to notice. A sharpening of my night vision that went beyond what the oculobe implants should have provided. A sensitivity to shadows that let me perceive depth and texture in darkness, so complete it should have been featureless void. I could see the grain of stone walls in rooms where my brothers fumbled blind, could track the heat signatures of living bodies through walls too thick for even our enhanced senses to penetrate. I told myself it was simply that my implants had taken especially well, that I was fortunate in my genetic compatibility, that this was the Emperor's blessing made manifest. I did not tell anyone when the shadows began to move on their own. It happened first during a night exercise in the catacombs beneath the fortress monastery, a labyrinth of tunnels that stretched for kilometers in every direction, filled with training servitors programmed to hunt us with live ammunition. We were supposed to reach the central vault without being detected or killed, a test of our stealth and tactical awareness. I was moving through a passage lit only by the faint bioluminescence of tunnel fungus when I saw a servitor approaching from the intersection ahead, its augmetic eyes sweeping the corridor in regular patterns. I pressed myself against the wall, controlling my breathing, waiting for the moment to slip past. But I did not need to wait. The shadows around me deepened, thickened, became almost tangible, and I felt myself sink into them like a man slipping beneath water. The servitor's eyes passed over me without pause, its targeting protocols finding nothing but empty stone. I stood frozen, not daring to move, not daring to breathe, feeling the darkness wrapped around me like a living cloak. When the servitor moved on, I stepped free of the shadows, and they released me reluctantly, peeling away from my skin with a sensation that was neither cold nor warm, but something outside the normal spectrum of temperature, something that made my gene seed pulse once, hard, as though in recognition. I completed the exercise in half the expected time. The instructors were pleased but confused, reviewing the picked feeds afterward and finding gaps in the recordings where I should have been visible but was not, anomalies they attributed to equipment malfunction or data corruption. I said nothing. I did not know what to say, did not have the words to describe what I had experienced, and some instinct older than my training warned me that speaking of it would be a mistake I could never undo. So I kept silent, and the changes continued. Over the following months, the shadow blending became easier, more natural, something I could invoke with barely a thought when the need arose. I began to test its limits in secret, slipping away from my brothers during rest periods to explore the deep catacombs alone, pushing myself into darker and darker spaces to see how far the ability extended. I found I could move through shadows as though they were doorways, stepping into the darkness in one location and emerging from another shadow meters away, the transition instantaneous and disorienting. I found I could compress my form, flattening myself against surfaces until I became nearly two-dimensional, a silhouette pressed into the stone that could slide along walls and floors without sound or substance. I found that when I remained in shadow too long, I began to forget why I had entered it in the first place. That was when the fear began. A cold understanding that settled into my bones and would not leave. The gene seed was changing me, but not in the ways the instructors described, not in the carefully controlled augmentations that produced enhanced strength and resilience and loyalty. This was something else, something unplanned and perhaps uncontrollable, and every time I used the shadow blending I felt a little more of myself erode, a little more of Kalor Vane dissolve into something that had no name and needed none. The whispers started on the night I completed my final trial and was elevated to the rank of Scout Marine. They came not from any external source, but from inside my own mind, voices that spoke in a language I did not consciously understand, but that resonated in my gene seed like the memory of a song heard in childhood. They called me Broodkin, they called me Shadowborn, they called me Fragment Self, and each term sent ripples of recognition through my transformed biology, as though my body knew what these words meant, even if my human consciousness did not. I tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the ceremony where Captain Shrike himself placed the scout insignia upon my armor and spoke the oaths that bound me to the chapter. But the whispers grew louder with each passing week, and soon they were no longer whispers but voices, clear and distinct, speaking with the authority of something far older than the Imperium itself. My first deployment was to the moon of Vorithis Prime, a dead rock orbiting a gas giant in a system recently reclaimed from Chaos forces. Intelligence indicated that a remnant warband of the Black Legion had established a hidden fortress within the Moon's equatorial canyon network, using it as a staging ground for raids on nearby Imperial shipping lanes. Our mission was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Infiltrate the fortress, eliminate the leadership, sabotage their munitions stockpiles, and withdraw before reinforcements arrived. We would be operating behind enemy lines with no support, no extraction plan, and no margin for error. It was exactly the kind of mission the Raven Guard excelled at, exactly the kind of operation I had trained my entire life to perform. We deployed via drop pod in the pre-dawn darkness of Vorithes's 30-hour night cycle, our pods screaming through the thin atmosphere to impact in a valley 15 kilometers from the target site. There were 10 of us, all scouts save for our commander, Sergeant Corax, a veteran of 2 centuries who moved with the fluid silence of spilled oil and whose eyes held a distance that suggested he had seen things he would never speak of. He gathered us in the shadow of a boulder field, while our pod's emergency scuttling charges reduced them to slag and ash, his voice low and controlled as he reviewed the mission parameters one final time. I remember the way the other scouts looked in that moment, young and fierce and utterly certain of their purpose, their faith in the Emperor and the Primarch so absolute it seemed to radiate from their skin like heat. I remember thinking I should feel the same way, that my dedication should be pure and unwavering, but all I felt was the gene seed pulsing in my chest, sending strange signals through my nervous system, and the shadows around me seeming to lean inward as though listening. We moved out in a dispersed formation, using the broken terrain for cover, our armor's camelioline cloaks blending us into the rust-colored landscape. The Moon's surface was a nightmare of shattered stone and radiation-warped geology, the product of ancient orbital bombardment that had cracked the crust and left it frozen in permanent tectonic agony. The canyons were deep enough to swallow Imperial Titans whole, their walls striated with mineral deposits that glowed faintly in the darkness, creating enough ambient light to navigate by, but not enough to be seen from above. We traveled in silence, communicating only through hand signals and vox clicks, each step calculated to avoid loose stone and unstable ground. Sergeant Corax set a brutal pace, pushing us hard despite the rough terrain, and I found myself falling into a rhythm that felt less like running and more like flowing, my body moving with an efficiency that bypassed conscious thought. The shadows welcomed me, parted for me, guided my steps over obstacles I could barely see. My brothers struggled with the darkness, their enhanced vision sufficient but not exceptional, while I moved with a certainty that drew concerned glances from those near enough to notice. We reached the canyon rim as the first thermal signatures appeared on our auspexes, heat blooms indicating enemy patrol patterns along the fortress perimeter. Sergeant Corax called for a halt, and we spent the next 3 hours observing the enemy movements, mapping their routes and timing their rotations, looking for gaps in their coverage that we could exploit. The Black Legion sentries were disciplined, their patrols overlapping with precision that suggested veteran leadership, but even the best patrol pattern had weaknesses if you watched long enough. I found myself staring at the fortress itself, a brutal structure of black stone and corroded metal that seemed to grow from the canyon walls like a tumor, its architecture twisted in ways that offended the eye and suggested geometries that should not exist in normal space. Chaos corruption had marked the stone, warping it into shapes that writhed at the edge of perception, and I could feel the gene seed in my chest reacting to the proximity of the enemy, sending pulses of anger and hunger through my system that made my hands shake. The rage came without warning. One moment I was crouched beside my brothers, observing the enemy with professional detachment, and the next I was fighting the overwhelming urge to leap down into the canyon and tear through the sentries with my bare hands, to paint the stone red and feel bones snap between my fingers. The fury was absolute and primal, something that bypassed all my training and discipline, and it took every ounce of willpower I possessed to remain still, to keep my breathing controlled, to prevent the howl building in my throat from escaping. Sergeant Corax's hand landed on my shoulder, heavy and grounding, and when I turned to look at him I saw recognition in his eyes, an understanding that chilled me more thoroughly than the rage had heated me. He knew what was happening to me, had perhaps seen it happen to others, and the slight nod he gave me was not reassurance but acknowledgement, a wordless communication that said we would speak of this never, that I would learn to control it or I would die, and that either outcome was acceptable to the chapter. The rage subsided slowly, leaving me shaking and cold, my gene seed settling back into its regular rhythm like a beast returning to sleep. We descended into the canyon 2 hours before dawn, using a narrow chimney formation that required us to climb down in single file, our movements painstakingly slow to avoid dislodging stones that would alert the enemy below. The descent took 40 minutes of controlled breathing and precise handholds. 40 minutes during which I felt the shadows deepening around me again, felt them sliding over my skin like oil, felt them whispering that I could simply step into the darkness and fall through it rather than climb, that the void would catch me if I trusted it enough. I did not trust it. I did not trust anything anymore. We reached the canyon floor in the dead space between patrol rotations, a 6-minute window that required perfect timing and left no room for error. Sergeant Corax led us directly toward the fortress walls, moving in a low crouch that kept us below the sightlines of the wall-mounted surveyors. The stone beneath our feet was smooth and cold, worn by centuries of wind and sand until it felt almost glassy, and our footsteps made no sound despite the weight of our armor and gear. The fortress entrance was a narrow sally port, reinforced with ceramite plating and guarded by 2 Chaos Space Marines in ancient power armor bearing the 8-pointed star. They stood motionless, their helms tracking back and forth in regular sweeps, their bolters held at ready positions that could be brought to bear in fractions of a second. Standard doctrine would require us to eliminate the sentries before proceeding, but standard doctrine assumed the sentries could see us coming. Sergeant Corax signaled for stealth elimination, designating me and another scout named Varan to approach and neutralize the guards with combat knives. Varan moved first, his camelioline cloak rippling as he inched forward, each movement glacially slow and perfectly controlled. I followed 5 paces behind, feeling the shadows gathering around me again, feeling them eager and hungry, and I realized with a start that I was not moving through normal space anymore but through some layer of reality that existed adjacent to it, a realm of darkness where distance and solidity were negotiable concepts. I reached the first sentry while Varan was still 10 paces away. The guard never saw me, never sensed my approach, never had time to react before my knife punched through the soft seal at the base of his helm and into his brain stem. He died instantly, his body going rigid for a moment before I lowered him silently to the ground, my hands moving with a precision that felt automatic, instinctive, as though I had performed this action 1,000 times before in lives I could not remember. The gene seed pulsed once, warm and satisfied, and I felt something in my consciousness shift, felt Kalor Vane recede slightly, while something else, something older and hungrier, rose to fill the space. Varan eliminated the second sentry with equal efficiency, and together we dragged the bodies into the shadows beside the entrance, where they would not be immediately visible. Sergeant Corax brought the rest of the squad forward, and we breached the sally port using a combination of lockpicks and tech prayer that bypassed the fortress's security systems without triggering alarms. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing a corridor that descended into the fortress depths, its walls carved with blasphemous symbols that seemed to writhe in the dim light. We entered the fortress, and I felt the gene seed pulse again, harder this time, as though responding to the proximity of chaos taint. The corridor was narrow and cramped, forcing us to move in single file, our weapons held at low ready as we advanced deeper into enemy territory. The air was thick with the smell of incense and decay, with underlying notes of something chemical and sharp that burned the back of my throat. The walls were warm to the touch, their surface slightly moist, and I realized with growing unease that the fortress was not simply corrupted but alive, its architecture animate and aware. We moved through the corridors like ghosts, eliminating isolated sentries and bypassing larger groups, our progress marked by bodies left cooling in the shadows and alarms that never sounded. The fortress interior was a labyrinth of intersecting passages and chambers, its layout defying logic and geometry. Rooms that should have been adjacent, separated by impossible distances, corridors that curved back on themselves without completing circles. Sergeant Corax, navigated by instinct and experience, never hesitating at intersections, always choosing the path that led deeper, always moving toward the fortress heart, where intelligence suggested the command structure resided. I was beginning to understand that my transformation was not unique. Brother Varron moved with a fluidity that suggested his bones were no longer entirely solid, his joints bending at angles that should have been impossible, his spine flexing in ways that allowed him to compress his body into spaces too small for a normal human. Brother Jeketh had developed a talent for mimicry that extended beyond voice, his features subtly shifting to echo the appearance of those he observed, his skin tone and facial structure becoming mutable. Brother Drask no longer seemed to breathe in any conventional sense, his chest unnaturally still, his presence creating dead zones in the air, where sound did not propagate correctly. We were all changing, all mutating in ways that enhanced our abilities while eroding our humanity, and Sergeant Corax moved among us with the calm acceptance of someone who had seen this transformation play out countless times before. He offered no explanation, no reassurance, no acknowledgement that anything unusual was occurring. He simply led us deeper into the fortress, his silence more communicative than any speech could have been. The first sign of serious resistance came when we reached the ritual chamber. It was a vast space carved from the living rock, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to extend upward forever, its floor covered in a complex mandala of dried blood and crushed bone. At the center of the chamber stood a massive altar built from welded armor plates and human remains, and upon that altar lay something that might once have been a man, but had been transformed into a living conduit for warp energy. His body swollen and distorted, his skin split in places to reveal pulsing organs that glowed with unnatural light. Around the altar stood 13 sorcerers in robes bearing the symbols of Tsentia, their chanting creating harmonics that resonated in the gene seed and made concentration nearly impossible. Sergeant Corax signaled for immediate withdrawal, recognizing that we had stumbled into something far beyond our mission parameters, but it was already too late. The sorcerers had sensed our presence, their chanting reaching a crescendo that shattered the shadows we had been using for concealment, and suddenly we were exposed and surrounded, warp fire blooming in the hands of our enemies as they turned to face us with expressions of malicious joy. The rage returned, overwhelming and absolute. I felt my consciousness fracture, felt Kalor veins splinter into fragments as something else surged up from the depths of my gene seed, something that knew only hunger and violence and the need to kill. I remember throwing myself toward the nearest sorcerer, my knife forgotten, my hands extended like claws, and I remember the sensation of tearing through his robes and into the flesh beneath, feeling his ribs crack under my fingers, feeling the hot rush of blood that tasted like copper and ash. I remember the way he screamed, a sound that held surprise and agony in equal measure, and I remember not caring, not feeling anything, except the imperative to destroy, to rend, to unmake. The chamber exploded into violence. My brothers were fighting with the same feral intensity, their individual mutations manifesting in combat in ways both horrifying and effective. Varron flowed around warp fire blasts like water, his body contorting impossibly to avoid attacks that should have incinerated him. Jeketh mimicked the appearance of a sorcerer, creating confusion in the enemy ranks that lasted just long enough for him to plant his knife in 3 throats before they realized the deception. Drask moved through the enemy formation without breathing, without sound, killing with mechanical efficiency that left bodies cooling in his wake. Sergeant Corax fought with the controlled precision of a master, his bolt pistol barking measured shots that found weak points in the sorcerer's defenses, but even he could not entirely suppress the changes that had claimed him over his long service. I saw shadows gather around him with unnatural density, saw them lash out like physical weapons to deflect incoming attacks, saw them wrap around wounded sorcerers and squeeze until bones snapped. The battle lasted less than 3 minutes, but those minutes felt like hours, stretched and distorted by the adrenaline and rage and the gene seed's influence. When the last sorcerer fell, his body still twitching as warp energies dissipated into the air, I found myself standing over a corpse I did not remember killing, my hands slick with blood that steamed in the chamber's cold air, my gene seed pulsing with a satisfaction so profound it felt almost sexual. The voices in my mind were louder now, no longer whispers but clear speech, and they were congratulating me, praising my efficiency, welcoming me deeper into the transformation that would eventually consume everything I had been. Sergeant Corvax's voice cut through the haze, sharp and commanding. He ordered us to regroup, to assess casualties, to prepare for immediate withdrawal. We had accomplished nothing except alerting the entire fortress to our presence, had gained no tactical advantage, and lost the element of surprise that was our greatest weapon. The mission was compromised, perhaps fatally, and standard doctrine demanded we abort and extract before the enemy could bring overwhelming force to bear. But something had changed in the chamber, something fundamental and irreversible. I could see it in the way my brothers moved, in the way they looked at each other and at Sergeant Corvax, in the way their postures had shifted from disciplined soldiers to pack predators. The transformations had accelerated during the combat, pushed forward by stress and violence and proximity to chaos corruption, and we were all teetering on the edge of something that might be evolution or devolution depending on perspective. The gene seed had taken control, asserting itself over our conscious minds, and I understood with perfect clarity that we were no longer entirely Raven Guard. We were becoming something else. Sergeant Corvax knew it too. I saw the recognition in his eyes, saw the calculation as he weighed our combat effectiveness against our psychological stability, saw him reach the conclusion that we were still useful, still capable of completing the mission despite the changes, or perhaps because of them. He gave the order to advance, to push deeper into the fortress, to complete our objective regardless of the cost, and we obeyed because obedience was still hardwired into our training, even if everything else was becoming negotiable. We left the ritual chamber through the far exit, moving faster now, no longer bothering with stealth, because the fortress was fully alert and stealth was meaningless. Alarms wailed through the corridors, echoing off stone walls until the sound became physical pressure. Emergency lumens blazed into life, flooding the passages with harsh red light that made the shadows dance and writhe. Enemy forces were mobilizing throughout the facility, their movements tracked by the vibrations in the stone, their deployment patterns readable to senses that had evolved beyond baseline human. We encountered the first response force in a corridor junction, a squad of cultists in flak armor with las guns and combat blades. They died before they could bring their weapons to bear, torn apart by scouts moving with inhuman speed and ferocity, their bodies left in pieces that steamed in the cold air. We did not slow down, did not pause to confirm kills, simply flowed through them like a wave of shadow and violence that left only death in its wake. The second force was more substantial, a mixed unit of Chaos Space Marines and possessed cultists that opened fire the moment we came into view. Bolter rounds tore through the corridor, their mass-reactive warheads detonating against the walls and filling the air with shrapnel. I remember diving into the shadows, feeling them enfold me, feeling myself become incorporeal as I slipped through the barrage like smoke through a grate. I emerged behind the enemy line, already moving, my knife finding the weak points in armor seals with precision that suggested I had studied these particular patterns for years. Brother Varron wrapped himself around a Chaos Marine like a serpent, his arms and legs impossibly elongated, his grip strong enough to crush ceramite. Brother Jeketh mimicked the voice of an enemy commander, issuing contradictory orders that caused confusion and friendly fire. Brother Drask killed without breathing, without making any sound whatsoever, his presence creating zones of silence that spread through the enemy formation like a contagion. We were magnificent and monstrous in equal measure. Sergeant Corvax fought at the formation center, his movements still precise and controlled but no longer entirely human, shadows flowing from his armor like liquid night, his eyes burning with cold fire that had nothing to do with his helmet's optical systems. He had become something ancient and terrible, something that carried the legacy of Corax but also something older, something that predated the Imperium and perhaps predated the species itself. We carved through the enemy forces with losses that should have been impossible, advancing deeper into the fortress despite escalating resistance, driven by gene seed imperatives that overrode pain and fear and rational tactical assessment. The mission objective ceased to matter. The orders ceased to matter. All that mattered was the movement forward, the killing, the transformation that was accelerating with every drop of blood spilled. The fortress command center was located in a chamber at the structure's core, accessible only through a heavily fortified corridor guarded by automated defenses and elite warriors. We approached it in a formation that had ceased to resemble any standard Raven Guard tactical doctrine, moving as a pack rather than a squad, our individual movements coordinating through some instinct that bypassed Vox communication. The automated turrets opened fire as we entered their range, their targeting systems tracking multiple contacts but struggling to lock onto targets that moved through shadows and between spaces. I felt myself dissolving again, felt my physical form becoming less solid, less defined, and I slipped through the kill zone like wind through branches. The turrets kept firing, their guns tracking empty air, their machine spirits unable to comprehend what I had become. I reached the control node and drove my knife through its primary logic engine, and the turrets died in sequence, their barrels drooping as power fled their systems. The elite guards were Black Legion veterans, warriors who had fought in the Heresy and survived 10,000 years of long war. They should have been our superiors in every respect, their experience and battlecraft sufficient to slaughter a squad of scouts even under ideal conditions. But we were no longer scouts, no longer soldiers in any conventional sense. We were predators operating on instincts refined by evolution and horror, and we tore through them with efficiency that reduced combat to simple execution. I remember very little of the actual fighting, only fragments that surface like debris from deep water. I remember the taste of blood, hot and rich, and strangely satisfying. I remember the sensation of bones breaking under my hands, the resistance, and then the sudden give as structural integrity failed. I remember the sound of screaming, both enemy and my own, though I cannot say which was which or whether they were truly separate sounds. I remember the gene seed pulsing in perfect rhythm with my heartbeat, flooding my system with chemicals that erased pain and fatigue and replaced them with euphoria so intense it approached religious ecstasy. When consciousness returned fully, I was standing in the command center, surrounded by corpses, my armor painted with blood and other fluids I could not identify. My brothers were in similar condition, their forms still subtly wrong, their postures suggesting predators rather than soldiers. Sergeant Corax stood before the command throne, staring at the enemy commander's body with an expression I could not read. The mission was complete. We had eliminated the Black Legion leadership, had destroyed their communications array, had sabotaged their ammunition stockpiles with demolition charges set on delayed timers. In 3 hours, the fortress would be rendered inoperable, its strategic value reduced to zero, and the Imperium's shipping lanes would be secure for another campaign cycle. By any objective measure, we had succeeded beyond expectations, had accomplished our objective despite catastrophic complications and overwhelming enemy resistance. But we had also lost something that could never be recovered. I looked at my hands, at the claws that had replaced my fingers, at the skin that seemed to ripple and shift between solidity and shadow, and I understood that Kaelor Vane no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The person I had been, the child from the underhives who had dreamed of serving the Emperor with honor and distinction, had been consumed by the gene seed's transformation, replaced by something that wore his memories like a stolen coat, but possessed neither his humanity nor his soul. Sergeant Corax gathered us for extraction, his voice still commanding but carrying an undertone of resignation that suggested he had been through this process before, many times before, with other scouts who had served faithfully and been rewarded with transformation. He led us back through the fortress, moving quickly now, our presence no longer requiring stealth because we had already accomplished our objective and mere survival was sufficient. The demolition charges would detonate in less than 2 hours, and we needed to be clear of the blast radius before the fortress transformed into a crater. We reached the surface as Vorithis' sun was rising, its weak light painting the canyon walls in shades of rust and amber. The extraction signal was already broadcasting, pulsing through the Vox channels to summon our retrieval craft, and we settled into defensive positions around the landing zone to await pickup. The wait should have been tense, should have been filled with the anticipation of enemy response forces seeking vengeance for their fallen leaders, but I felt only emptiness, a profound disconnection from the situation that suggested my emotional responses were no longer functioning correctly. Brother Varan sat beside me, his form still subtly distorted, his spine curved in ways that suggested his skeletal structure had fundamentally changed. He did not speak, did not acknowledge my presence, simply stared at the horizon with eyes that had lost their human qualities and gained something else, something alien and cold. Brother Jeketh was practicing his mimicry, his face cycling through different configurations, testing the limits of his transformation with the detached curiosity of someone examining a new tool. Brother Drask had stopped moving entirely, becoming so still that he might have been mistaken for a statue, his chest unmoving, his eyes unblinking. We were monsters wearing the insignia of heroes. The extraction craft arrived on schedule, a Thunderhawk painted in the black and white of the Raven Guard, its pilot executing a perfect combat landing that positioned the assault ramp directly before us. We boarded in silence, strapping into the restraint harnesses that lined the troop compartment, our weapons secured in the ready racks beside our seats. The Thunderhawk lifted off immediately, its engines screaming as it clawed for altitude, racing to achieve escape velocity before the demolition charges transformed the fortress into an expanding sphere of fire and shrapnel. I watched through the viewport as Vorithis fell away beneath us, watched as the fortress detonated right on schedule, the explosion propagating through the canyon system like a wave, collapsing tunnels and obliterating structures in a display of destructive force that would have been beautiful if I still possessed the capacity for aesthetic appreciation. The mission was complete, our objective accomplished, our duty to the Emperor fulfilled, but I knew, with certainty that approached prophecy, that we would never speak of what had happened in that fortress, never acknowledge the transformations that had claimed us, never admit that the gene seed had revealed its true nature and shown us what we were destined to become. The flight back to our strike cruiser took 4 hours. 4 hours during which Sergeant Corvax debriefed us individually in the Thunderhawk's communications booth, his questions precise and focused on tactical details rather than personal experience. He asked about enemy strength, about fortress layout, about the effectiveness of our weapons and tactics, but he never asked about the transformations, never acknowledged the changes that were visible to anyone with eyes, never spoke the words that would make our condition official and therefore actionable. When my turn came, I answered his questions with mechanical precision, reciting facts and observations while carefully avoiding any mention of the gene seed's influence or the voices that had grown so loud they now constituted a constant background chorus in my thoughts. He listened without interruption, his eyes studying me with an intensity that suggested he was seeing far more than I was saying, and when I finished, he simply nodded and dismissed me back to the troop compartment. I understood then that the silence was not ignorance but policy, that the chapter knew exactly what was happening to its scouts, had perhaps always known, had perhaps designed the gene seed modifications specifically to produce these results. The transformations were not failures but features, enhancements that made us more effective at the cost of our humanity, tools that would be used and discarded as mission parameters required. We were weapons, nothing more and nothing less, and weapons did not require acknowledgement or comfort. The strike cruiser Umbral Talon received us with the cold efficiency that characterized all Raven Guard vessels, its docking bay silent except for the clang of maglocks and the hiss of atmospheric equalization. We disembarked into the arms of waiting apothecaries who scanned us with medical auspexes, their expressions neutral as they recorded data that would never be shared beyond the chapter's inner circles. They pronounced us fit for duty without comment on our condition, without acknowledgement of the obvious physical changes, their professional detachment absolute. We were dismissed to the scout barracks, a Spartan compartment in the ship's lower decks that offered bunks and weapon maintenance facilities but little else. The other scouts from different squads avoided us when we entered, their instincts warning them that we were no longer quite the same as them, no longer quite brothers but something adjacent and dangerous. We did not attempt to socialize or integrate, simply claimed empty bunks and settled into the routines of post-mission maintenance, cleaning weapons and repairing armor, and pretending that nothing fundamental had changed. But the voices never stopped whispering. They spoke of the Brood Collective, of the Shadow Chain, of the fragment consciousness that bound us to something larger than ourselves. They spoke of Corax's legacy and the price of his genetic gifts, of the modifications made to the gene seed in the aftermath of the Heresy, when the Primarch had attempted to create perfect warriors and instead birthed something between angel and abomination. They spoke of the truth that the chapter guarded with absolute secrecy, the truth that would be denied with lethal force if it ever threatened to become public knowledge. The truth was that we were not being enhanced but replaced, our individual identities slowly erased by the gene seed's influence, until what remained was an empty vessel filled with programmed responses and predatory instinct. The truth was that the Raven Guard had discovered how to create soldiers who could operate in conditions that would break normal space marines, who could infiltrate and kill without hesitation or mercy or moral complexity, but the cost was the complete sacrifice of the individuals who bore the gene seed. The truth was that Kaelor Vane was already dead, had died the moment the transformation began, and what walked around wearing his body was something else, something that would serve faithfully until it was no longer useful, and then would be quietly eliminated before it could become a liability. I should have felt horror at this revelation. I should have felt rage or grief or desperate determination to resist, to fight back against the gene seed's influence, to reclaim my humanity before it was completely subsumed. But I felt nothing except distant academic interest, as though I were observing someone else's tragedy through thick glass, and I understood that this absence of emotion was itself evidence of how far the transformation had progressed. 3 days after our return, Sergeant Corvax summoned us to a briefing chamber deep in the ship's core, a room without viewports or external access, its walls lined with sound-dampening material that prevented any conversation from being overheard. He waited until we had sealed the chamber door before speaking, his voice low and controlled, and what he said next would have destroyed me if I had still been capable of being destroyed. He told us we were not unique. He told us that every scout who survived the initial gene seed implantation underwent similar transformations, that the changes we experienced were expected and documented, that the Raven Guard had been producing warriors like us for 10,000 years in an unbroken chain of genetic modification and psychological erosion. He told us that the chapter maintained entire companies of transformed scouts, warriors who operated in the deepest shadows and undertook missions too dark to be acknowledged even by Space Marine standards. He told us that we would join those companies, would serve in operations where success was measured not by victory but by acceptable losses, where our lives were resources to be expended rather than brothers to be valued. He told us that we would never be permitted to advance beyond scout rank, that the transformation made us unsuitable for the additional surgeries required to become full battle brothers, that we would remain scouts until we died or became too unstable to be useful. He told us this was an honor. He told us that we carried Corax's true legacy, that we were the weapon the Primarch had intended to create before his vision was compromised by those who could not understand his genius. He told us we should be proud to serve in this capacity, that our sacrifice was meaningful, that our names would be remembered even if our deeds could never be recorded. He told us all of this in a tone that suggested he had delivered this speech countless times before, to countless other scouts who had stood in this same chamber and heard these same words and made these same choices. The choice was simple: accept the transformation and continue to serve, or resist and be eliminated as a threat to chapter security. It was not really a choice at all. I looked at my brothers, at Varan and Jeketh and Drask, and I saw the same resignation in their eyes that I felt in my own chest. We had become something that could not be allowed to exist outside the chapter's control, had gained abilities that would mark us as mutants and heretics if discovered by the Inquisition, had crossed a threshold that made integration with normal humanity impossible. The only path forward was service, continued service until death or madness claimed us, and the chapter would use us thoroughly before either outcome was permitted. We accepted. What else could we do? The years that followed blurred together into an endless sequence of deployments and operations, each mission darker than the last, each objective more morally complex than baseline scouts would have been trusted to handle. We eliminated Imperial officials whose loyalty had wavered, assassinated Inquisitors who had grown too curious about the Raven Guard's methods, sabotaged rival chapters' operations when political considerations demanded it. We operated in the spaces between official records, ghosts who accomplished necessary tasks and then dissolved back into shadow before questions could be asked. The transformations continued, deepening with each mission, each act of violence feeding the gene seed and accelerating the changes. I lost the ability to perceive color, my vision shifting into a spectrum that existed somewhere between normal sight and something else, a realm where darkness had texture and shadow carried weight. My hearing extended beyond normal acoustic ranges, picking up vibrations and pressures that normal humans could not detect, until silence became a cacophony of information. My sense of touch degraded, pain and pleasure becoming indistinguishable sensations that barely registered against the gene seed's constant background radiation. I forgot what I had looked like before the transformation. I forgot the names of my family, forgotten faces from the underhives whose voices had once meant something but now carried no emotional weight whatsoever. I forgot what food tasted like, what rest felt like, what it meant to experience simple human joy. I forgot Kalor Vane piece by piece, memory by memory, until what remained was a collection of facts about a person who no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The voices that had once whispered became my constant companions, speaking with clarity that eventually surpassed my own internal monologue. They guided me through missions, suggesting tactics and approaches that I would not have considered consciously, their ancient knowledge surpassing anything the chapter's training had provided. They comforted me when the isolation became too profound, reminding me that I was part of something larger, that my individual suffering was meaningless compared to the collective purpose. They lied, of course, but I no longer possessed the capacity to recognize deception. The final mission came without warning, without preparation, without any suggestion that it would be different from the dozens that had preceded it. We were deployed to a forge world in the Segmentum Tempestus, tasked with eliminating a tech priest Magos who had begun experimenting with xenotech in violation of the Mechanicus's most sacred prohibitions: standard infiltration, standard assassination, standard extraction. The kind of operation we had performed so many times it should have been routine, but something was different this time. Something fundamental that I could not quite identify until we were already committed. The Forge world's name was Metallica Secundus, a factory planet whose surface had been entirely covered by industrial complexes that stretched from pole to pole, their smokestacks pumping toxic waste into an atmosphere too thick to breathe without filtration. We infiltrated through a waste recycling system, swimming through rivers of industrial effluent that would have killed baseline humans in seconds, but merely corroded our armor and made tracking difficult. The Magos maintained laboratories in the planet's core, research facilities buried beneath kilometers of machinery and molten metal, and our route took us through maintenance tunnels that had not been inspected in centuries. The descent took 3 days, 3 days of crawling through ducts barely wide enough to accommodate our armor. 3 days of heat that approached lethal limits even for enhanced physiology. 3 days of isolation broken only by vox clicks that confirmed we were still alive and mobile. I felt the gene seed responding to the stress, felt it pushing new changes through my system, felt my body adapting in real time to conditions that should have been impossible to survive. By the time we reached the laboratory level, I was no longer entirely solid. My body had become something between flesh and shadow, my physical form existing in multiple states simultaneously, able to pass through solid matter when concentration was sufficient. The other members of my squad had undergone similar changes, their transformations tailored to the mission's specific requirements in ways that suggested the gene seed possessed intelligence and intentionality beyond mere biological programming. We infiltrated the laboratory complex during a shift change, slipping through security cordons that should have been impenetrable, moving through spaces that normal intruders could never access. The Magos maintained dozens of research chambers, each dedicated to different xenotech projects, each containing artifacts and specimens that would have warranted immediate exterminatus if their existence became known to the Ordo Xenos. We found the Magos in his primary laboratory, a vast chamber filled with containment fields holding objects that hurt to look at directly, their geometries existing outside normal three-dimensional space. He was not alone. A delegation of Eldar stood with him, their alien forms elegant and terrible, their presence suggesting cooperation that transcended mere technological exchange and entered the realm of active alliance. This was heresy beyond measure. This was treason that implicated not just one tech priest but potentially entire Forge World leadership structures, corruption that could spread throughout the Mechanicus if not contained immediately and absolutely. The mission parameters expanded in an instant, transforming from simple assassination into something approaching small-scale war, and Sergeant Corvax's orders reflected the new reality with brutal clarity. Kill everyone. Destroy everything. We attacked with the full fury of our transformations unleashed, shadows given form and purpose, predators operating without restraint or mercy. The Eldar died first, their superior reflexes and precognition insufficient to track targets that existed partially outside normal space-time. The Magos' bodyguards died next, their augmetic enhancements and programmed loyalties useless against opponents who could phase through their defenses. The Magos himself died last, his pleas for understanding and his explanations of mutual benefit silenced by Sergeant Corvax's bolt pistol placed against his forehead. But the operation had taken too long, and reinforcements were already arriving. Entire companies of Skitarii converging on the laboratory complex with orders to contain the situation regardless of casualties. We found ourselves trapped in the complex's lower levels, surrounded by thousands of enemies, our extraction routes compromised, our survival chances approaching zero. Sergeant Corvax gave the order I had been dreading since the transformation began. He ordered us to embrace the gene seed fully, to allow the final stages of transformation to complete, to become what the Primarch had originally intended his sons to become before imperial politics and moral considerations forced him to modify his plans. He told us the truth that had been withheld until this moment, the secret that the chapter had guarded for 10 millennia with absolute ruthlessness. The gene seed was not derived entirely from Corax. During the Heresy, the Primarch had discovered fragments of xenotech on a dead world, artifacts from a civilization that had mastered the manipulation of shadow and darkness, that had evolved beyond physical form into beings of pure umbral energy. He had integrated elements of that technology into his own genetic material, had created gene seed that carried both human and Xenos elements, had birthed warriors who could walk between worlds and strike from dimensions that normal perception could not access. He had created monsters, perfect weapons for a war that demanded victory regardless of cost. The Imperium had forced him to destroy his creations when the modifications were discovered, had demanded he purge his legion of all xenotech contamination, had threatened him with censure and punishment if he did not comply. Corax had obeyed, had seemingly destroyed all his modified warriors, had retreated into self-imposed exile haunted by what he had done, but he had preserved samples of the original gene seed, had hidden them within the chapter's genetic repositories, had ensured that future generations would have access to the power he had discovered if the need became sufficiently desperate. The transformed scouts were his legacy, warriors who carried the true gene seed rather than the sanitized version approved by the Imperium, soldiers who could operate in conditions that would destroy normal space marines. We were his children, born from a union of human and Xenos, and our existence was heresy beyond measure. Sergeant Corvax told us to choose, die as humans or live as something else. I felt the gene seed surge in response to the choice, felt it eager and hungry, felt it pushing against the final restraints that kept me anchored to physical reality. The voices that had whispered for so long became a roar, a chorus of ancient intelligences welcoming me into their collective, promising power and purpose and belonging that transcended individual identity. I let go. The transformation completed in seconds that felt like years, my body dissolving into shadow and reforming into something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, something that could perceive and act across layers of reality that normal consciousness could not comprehend. I felt my individual identity fragmenting, felt Kalor Vane's final memories dissolving like salt in water, felt myself becoming part of something vast and ancient and utterly inhuman. My brothers underwent similar changes, their forms becoming fluid and mutable, their consciousness expanding to encompass perspectives that no single mind should hold. We were no longer individuals but fragments of a collective intelligence, warriors who shared thoughts and perceptions across distances that made conventional communication meaningless. We killed everyone in the Forge complex. We moved through walls and armor and flesh with equal ease, existing simultaneously in the physical world and the shadow realm, striking from angles that defenders could not anticipate or protect against. We consumed the Skitarii by the hundreds, absorbing their biomechanical components into our own fluid forms, growing larger and more terrible with each kill. We destroyed the Xenotech artifacts, not through demolition but through incorporation, taking their exotic technologies into ourselves and making them part of our expanding capabilities. We became the catastrophe that the Mechanicus would spend centuries trying to explain away, the incident that would be classified under 17 different security protocols and eventually attributed to warp manifestation rather than Imperial forces. When the killing finally stopped, when the last defender had fallen and the last laboratory had been scoured, I found myself standing in a chamber I did not remember entering, surrounded by corpses I did not remember creating. My body had stabilized into a form that approximated human shape, but deviated in countless subtle ways. Skin that flowed like oil, limbs that terminated in appendages that were neither hands nor claws but something between, eyes that saw in spectrums that had no names in any human language. Sergeant Corax stood nearby, his form similarly transformed, but somehow retaining more humanity than the rest of us. His consciousness strong enough to maintain individual identity despite the collective's pull. He was looking at me with an expression I could not read, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that suggested he was speaking simultaneously in physical sound and some other medium I could perceive but not describe. He told me I had done well. He told me the mission was complete, the heresy contained, the chapter's secrets preserved. He told me I would be rewarded for my service, that my name would be recorded in the hidden annals where the chapter chronicled its most effective weapons. He told me I had proven myself worthy of the gene seed's true gifts, that I had become what Corax had always intended his sons to become. He told me I would never be permitted to return to normal service, that my transformation was too complete to be reversed, that I would serve henceforth in the most secret of the chapter's brotherhoods, operating in missions too dark to be acknowledged even within the Raven Guard's already secretive structure. He told me I would live forever, my consciousness preserved within the Shadow Collective, even as my physical form eventually degraded, my knowledge and experience passed down to future generations of transformed scouts who would carry on the work I had begun. He told me this was the greatest honor the chapter could bestow. I understood then that there was no escape, no possibility of redemption or return, no hope of ever reclaiming the humanity I had sacrificed. I was a weapon now, nothing more. A tool whose purpose was killing and whose reward was continued existence in service of that purpose. The person I had been, the child from the underhives who had dreamed of serving with honor, was so completely erased that I could barely remember what those concepts had meant. But I also understood something Sergeant Corax had not said, something the voices in the Shadow Collective whispered with cold certainty. This was not unique to the Raven Guard. Every chapter maintained similar secrets, similar genetic modifications that pushed Space Marines beyond humanity and into territories that the Imperium would classify as mutation or corruption if discovered. The blood drinking of the Blood Angels, the skin wearing of the Space Wolves, the flesh crafting of the Iron Hands. These were not aberrations but features, intentional modifications that made the Adeptus Astartes more effective at the cost of their humanity. We were all monsters, every one of us, and the Imperium's survival depended on never acknowledging that truth. The extraction came days later, a heavily modified transport that could navigate the Shadow Realm and retrieve us from locations that conventional craft could not access. We boarded in silence, our transformed bodies settling into restraint systems designed for beings that did not quite conform to physical laws. The ship departed without fanfare, without celebration, without any acknowledgement of what we had accomplished or what we had become. I found a viewport and watched Metallica Secundus fall away beneath us, watched the planet shrink into insignificance against the void's vast darkness, and I felt nothing. No relief at survival, no grief for what had been lost, no anticipation of what awaited. Just emptiness, profound and absolute, the absence where emotion and identity and humanity had once resided. The voices told me this was freedom. They told me I had transcended the limitations of individual consciousness, had evolved beyond the crude boundaries of flesh and self, had become part of something greater and more enduring than any single life could be. They told me I should celebrate this liberation, should embrace my new existence without regret or hesitation. But somewhere in the depths of the Shadow Collective, in a space so remote and fragmented that it barely qualified as consciousness, a tiny fragment of Kalor Vane remained. It could not speak, could not act, could only observe and remember and grieve for everything that had been lost. It understood that it would persist in this state indefinitely, watching through alien eyes as the body it had once inhabited committed acts that would have horrified the person it had been, experiencing torment that would continue until the final dissolution that came only with death. And it understood that death, when it finally came, would not be an ending but a transfer, its experiences and knowledge absorbed into the collective and distributed among future generations of transformed scouts, its suffering immortalized and replicated across countless iterations. This was the truth of the Raven Guard. This was the price of Corax's legacy. This was what it meant to serve in the shadows, to become the weapon that struck from darkness, to sacrifice everything that made you human in exchange for the ability to protect humanity from threats it could never acknowledge or understand. We returned to the strike cruiser Umbral Talon, returned to duties and missions and operations that blurred together into endless repetition. I lost track of time, lost the ability to distinguish one deployment from another, lost any sense of progression or purpose beyond the immediate imperative to kill and survive and kill again. The chapter used us without hesitation, deployed us to situations too toxic for regular forces, spent our lives with the casual efficiency of someone expending ammunition. Some of my brothers were lost in combat, their physical forms destroyed beyond the gene seed's ability to regenerate, their consciousness fragments absorbed into the collective where they would persist as memories and tactical knowledge. Others succumbed to instability, their transformations progressing beyond controllable parameters, requiring termination before they could become threats to chapter security. I witnessed these endings without emotional response, understanding intellectually that they should matter, but unable to generate feelings appropriate to the events. The fragment of Kalor Vane that persisted in the Shadow Collective depths grew smaller with each passing year, compressed by the weight of accumulated experience and alien consciousness, eventually reduced to little more than a persistent memory of having once been something other than what I had become. And then came the day when even that fragment finally dissolved, when the last trace of individual identity was absorbed into the collective, and I became purely what I had been created to be, a weapon without conscience, a killer without remorse, a shadow without substance. The Raven Guard does not speak of what becomes of scouts like me. We exist in classified records accessible only to the chapter's highest leadership, our names recorded in hidden archives that will never be opened, our deeds attributed to other units or filed under security classifications that ensure they will never be reviewed. When we finally fall, when our usefulness ends, and our bodies can no longer sustain the transformation, we are not given the honors accorded to fallen battle brothers. We are not interred in the chapter's ossuaries. We are not remembered in the liturgies or mourned in the chapels. We are simply erased, our gene seed extracted and returned to the apothecarian for implantation in the next generation of scouts, our remains disposed of through methods that leave no trace, our existence denied with such completeness that it becomes truth. This is the secret the Raven Guard protects above all others, the knowledge that would destroy the chapter if it became public, the truth that contradicts every principle the Imperium claims to embody. We are Xenos-tainted, genetically corrupted, walking violations of the Emperor's original vision for the Adeptus Astartes. Our existence is heresy. Our continued service is apostasy. Our effectiveness is the only justification for our survival. And we are not alone. Every chapter maintains similar secrets, carries similar contaminations, harbors similar monsters in its ranks. The Imperium's survival depends on weapons it can never acknowledge, on soldiers who have transcended humanity and become something that exists in the spaces between heroism and abomination. We are the price of victory in a galaxy where victory requires sacrifices that cannot be named. I tell you this now because I am finally dying, my physical form degraded beyond recovery, my consciousness fragmenting as the Shadow Collective prepares to absorb what remains. In the final moments before dissolution, the voices have granted me one last gift: the clarity to understand what has been done to me, the ability to see my transformation with perspective unclouded by the gene seed's influence. I understand now that there was never a choice, never a moment when I could have resisted or refused, never a possibility of maintaining my humanity against forces that had been refined over 10,000 years, specifically to overcome such resistance. From the moment I was selected from the underhives, I was already lost, already condemned to become what I became, already reduced to resource and weapon and expendable asset. But I also understand that my sacrifice, and the sacrifices of countless others like me, has meaning despite its horror. The missions we accomplished, the threats we eliminated, the secrets we protected have preserved the Imperium through crises that would have destroyed it otherwise. We are the price humanity pays for survival, the cost that must be paid but can never be acknowledged. This is not redemption. This is not justification. This is simply truth, cold and absolute and unforgiving. I was Kalor Vane, child of the Underhives, scout of the Raven Guard, bearer of Corax's true legacy. I served with everything I possessed, gave everything I was, and became something that could never be forgiven, even if forgiveness were possible. My name will be forgotten, my deeds unrecorded, my existence denied, but the work I did will echo through generations in ways both visible and hidden. This is what it means to be Raven Guard. This is what it means to serve in the shadows. This is the twisted life we lead, and the twisted death that claims us, and the twisted immortality that persists afterward in forms that bear no resemblance to the people we once were. The darkness is rising now, the Shadow Collective pulling me inward, the final dissolution beginning. The voices are welcoming me home, promising rest and integration and purpose that transcends individual suffering. They are lying, but I no longer possess the capacity to care. Somewhere in the black spaces between stars, other scouts are beginning their transformation, experiencing the same progression I endured, making the same choices I made, becoming the same weapons I became. They will never know my name, will never hear this testament, will never understand what awaits them at the end of service, and that is how it must be. The Raven Guard protects its secrets absolutely, and we are the darkest secret of all.